thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. As Devin said, we have been working with the SPARCC team for about 2 years. And I have to say, the SPARCC national team has just been a fantastic partner through this process. We are so happy to be sharing the fruits of our labor, basically, of the last 2 years. And I do want to give a quick shout out, of course, thank you, Devin, for, all of your efforts through these past 2 years in shaping the project. I want to give a quick shout out to also Varunda Vagela at Enterprise Community Partners, Catherine Cox Blair at Natural Resources Defense Council, Nick Collins at LIF, of course, Ella for helping to organize everything today, Dr. Tiffany Manuel, again, for really being a great thought partner in helping make today happen. And of course, this project wouldn't be possible without the SPARCC partners, the local partners across all of the sites in Atlanta, Chicago, Denver, and Memphis. And the list is very long, but for those of you who are here representing those SPARCC affiliates, thank you so much again for all of your work these past 2 years. So with that, today, we're going to share a little bit about what we kind of came up with our maps. We came up with some maps for Atlanta, Chicago, Denver, and Memphis, highlighting neighborhood change patterns. And another product of the research was just a new framework for thinking about how to measure gentrification and displacement in those particular cities. And thankfully, through the process of doing this particular project, we've been able to reassess how we actually analyze the data and how we bring in new sources. So my colleague, Tim Thomas, who's here today with me, will share a little bit more of that in a moment. Next. So just to quickly go over our agenda for today. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of what we're calling the Urban Displacement Replication Project, which was essentially us creating these maps for Atlanta, Chicago, Denver, and Memphis. I'm going to hand it over to Tim to talk a little bit more specifically about the maps and our key findings about neighborhood change patterns across those 4 cities. And I'm going to end with a couple strategies for thinking about anti-displacement advocacy moving forward. And the hope is that this will help to tee up a conversation with Dr. Tiffany Manuel about how to actually make the case for anti-displacement. Next. So we can go on to the next slide. So just a little bit about us. The Urban Displacement Project is a research and action initiative at UC Berkeley, which uses research to reframe conversations, empower communities and advocates and policymakers, and to train and inspire the next generation of leaders in equitable development. And the Urban Displacement Project is actually a program of the Center for Community Innovation. I'm actually the executive director of the Center for Community Innovation. And we do a lot of different other kinds of projects, but really the main thrust of our work for the last 5 years or so has been around urban displacement. Next. So this is actually a very exciting time for the Urban Displacement Project, because not only did we do these maps for Atlanta, Chicago, Denver, and Memphis, but we are in the process of releasing a number of maps for cities actually around the world. And we started in 2015 with this work focusing on San Francisco and also LA. So that was kind of our bread and butter in terms of the work itself. And since then, we've gotten so many requests from cities all over the world, and we've tried to meet those requests the best we can. And luckily, if you go to our website now, you'll see many updated maps, including those for San Francisco and LA. And you'll see a number of new maps, including the 4 that we're going to talk about today. So I do encourage you to dig deeper in at urbandisplacement.org. So just to describe a little bit the project that we worked on with the SPARCC national team, really the goal of this project was first to understand the local dynamics and common themes around gentrification and displacement across sites. In our work, there's often an assumption that gentrification and displacement is only something that happens in the New Yorks or the San Franciscos or the LAs, but really neighborhood change is happening in different ways across the country. So we really wanted to get at what's specific about Atlanta, Chicago, Denver, and Memphis, and what's also universal if we look across those cities. Second, we wanted to be able to translate that analysis into maps that can be used for local action. And Tim will talk a little bit more about the open source code that we've also made available now, so that any city, any community could actually use this code to create their own gentrification and displacement maps. And this is in part to respond to the enormous response we always get from cities to do maps like this for them. And now we're providing a publicly available resource that allows folks to actually do what we did. And finally, the goal of the project, Tim, if you want to go back really quick. Thank you. Finally, the third goal of the project was to inform a national conversation about the importance of anti-displacement strategies for equitable development. And I'll come back to this point at the very end. We're in a unique moment right now, given the pandemic, given kind of everything going on post-election. So now is really the time to leverage this moment to put anti-displacement on a national agenda. And I will come back to that a little bit later. Next. So just to describe a little bit about our process, so we were very intent on engaging local SPARCC affiliates in the process of both creating the methodology for our maps, which Tim will talk about, as well as the maps themselves. So we did extensive engagement with folks across all of the sites, and thank you to those of you who are here on the call today. And there were many things that came up in those conversations about what is happening on the ground in terms of neighborhood change. And so some of the themes that we kind of parsed out from those conversations, which you can read about more in one of our working papers, which we also published with the maps, which are now available, is that racial equity, investment-driven displacement, disinvestment-driven displacement, social determinants of health, and climate-related displacement were all kind of common themes that came up in the conversations, although they looked different across each of the individual sites. And I should mention, there are many areas across the US where there is investment happening in areas that were previously disinvested, but alongside of that investment are areas that continue to be disinvested, and that's something that we particularly saw in Memphis. So I just wanted to mention that, but again, if you want to dig into more of the details, do feel free to check out our working paper on the topic. Next. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tim Thomas. He's going to talk a little bit more about the maps themselves. Tim?
Thanks, Renee, so much for this opportunity, and we're very excited to be putting this out. I'm going to put in the chat real quick the location of the open source code real quick. It's largely on GitHub, and what you can do is replicate the code for any city that you want, or kind of take a look at any part of it. But I'll just discuss that a little more in the Q&A if there's some interest in that. But for now, what we'd like to do is talk about some of the primary differences between our old 2015 maps that we did for San Francisco and LA. These were the original gentrification displacement maps that we did. In particular, we highlighted 5 key changes. We brought in a new income categorization for tracts. So instead of just using groups that were above a median or below a median, we actually highlighted groups that were represented in different income levels between low, moderate, and median income. We've also worked on a clarification of disinvestment-driven displacement. So in the original gentrification and displacement typologies, disinvestment-driven displacement was grouped into a category that was called at risk of gentrification. This category in our modified typology, we found it was important to look at disinvestment-driven displacement in what we call now ongoing displacement of low-income households typology. What I'll point out in the moment here is that largely there's 3 different groups of tiers of sorts. They don't necessarily work in succession, but it starts usually with low income or susceptible to displacement households or displaced households preceding gentrification, and then that precedes exclusion, areas that people can't move into because they're just too expensive or too costly to move into. We also, for point number 3, we improved our housing value and rental data using Zillow data. We also started to consider proximity of tracts nearby. In other words, areas that see rising costs in nearby neighborhoods. We account for that measure as well as what we call a new measure called the rent gap. Basically, what is the local rent versus the nearby rent, and how does that compare to the rest of the region? And finally, we added additional overlays to try and that these overlays, such as our risk factors, such as rail stations or redlining maps. In some of our maps, we actually have neighborhood segregation highlighted. But what these sections do is it helps expand the narrative a little bit more, just beyond gentrification, but also to talk about, okay, what are the particular built environment characteristics or social demographics that are related to these dynamics. So let's move into looking at some of these maps. The first one we're going to look at is Atlanta. So I'm just going to pop out of here real quick, and hopefully everyone can see this. This basically, if you go on the link down at the bottom, urban-displacement.github.io, yada yada. We'll post this in the chat here in a second. But largely what you can do is you can navigate to different cities. I'll just kind of talk about some of the features of the map, and then I'll go into some of the details and findings of each of the map. As you can see, as I move over and hover over the map, we see different kind of labels popping up. So for example, these labels at risk of gentrification or low income, susceptible to displacement, are highlighted over here on the right-hand side of the displacement typology. And this is the kind of 3 categories that I was talking about a little bit. We have low income, susceptible to displacement. These are folks that have faced a lot of long periods of low income housing. And there's ongoing displacement that precedes risk of gentrification, early ongoing gentrification, advanced gentrification. I'll talk a little bit more about advanced gentrification versus at risk in a minute. And then there are these areas of stable, moderate income, mixed income, which are these lighter spaces. And they ramp up to becoming exclusive to stable, advanced exclusive. Largely, on our website, if you go to our open source code, we highlight what criteria fits into each of these units to kind of highlight how these spaces are determined. And what we do with these maps is kind of highlight where these spaces are happening. If you click on a tract itself, you can actually see the name and some other demographic characteristics that are highlighted here. So right here, I've clicked on a tract that is in Atlanta that is at risk of gentrification towards the west side of Atlanta downtown. And it shows you home values, tract median rents, demographics, POC population. This one in particular has a 92% Black population. The percent of students there, so that we can differentiate between what's truly low income versus student poverty. And also the other risk factors that kind of went into some of these categories. So you can zoom into the sections and highlight here. And what we saw in Atlanta, I'm actually from Atlanta myself, so this was an interesting map to build. Up here on the north side, we see a lot of at risk of becoming exclusive, stable, advanced exclusive, other areas like that. And as we move to the south side, which is a predominantly segregated area in Atlanta, we see a lot more susceptible to displacement, at risk of gentrification, especially nearby some of these bordering areas. And this is something that we found, is that there's a bordering effect that kind of happens between exclusive areas and areas that are at risk of gentrification that are important to look at. If you slide down here on the right, we have a whole host of other features that we can put in here. We had the community suggested input put here as a separate layer to kind of highlight some areas that we didn't necessarily, the data didn't really pick up on what locals were seeing. And so we felt that it was important to highlight those areas in red and show the suggestions that our community stakeholders were suggesting about this tract in particular. We also highlight where opportunity zones are located at. We also show where redlined areas are at. These are areas that were designed back in the 1930s to deny or provide access to loans. As you can see, anything that's a green or a grade A or grade B had a higher opportunity of getting a loan, but anything that was C or D was considered declining or hazardous. It was also found that these areas were targeted by race, and this can show and build within areas. And today, segregation persists because of these redlining behaviors. We also highlight neighborhood segregation. I'm going to close the displacement typology real quick just to show this feature. This is an interesting feature that we've built based on research that basically what it does is it highlights the proportions of populations and shows tract level segregation patterns at a small scale. So basically any group out of the 5 major groups, whites, Black, Asian, Latinx, or other, which is a whole host of other ethnic or racial groups, any group that's above 10% is labeled in here. So in other words, the Black-white tract has above 10% Black and above 10% white. See, my internet is unstable. Hopefully y'all can still hear me okay. But as you can see, this highlights in the south side here, the level of Black segregation that's happened in over the century in Atlanta, and highlighting a lot of the other areas where it's mixed or mostly white or things like that. With that, we can also show where the hospitals are located. Pop back the displacement layer. These institutions have been known for showing where gentrification might grow. Universities and colleges, public housing, transit stations, and also the industrial sites that we see here. These are not necessarily prone to gentrification, but industrial sites actually is a negative effect for a lot of these areas. And in particular for Atlanta, we highlighted where the Beltline was located because we've heard from our local sources that this is a prime predictor of gentrification, and highlights that. So this, I spent a little extra time on this map in particular just to kind of show the features of how these maps operate and work. And now what I'm going to do is just kind of pop into some of the other ones. But before I do that, I just wanted to highlight, we did a analysis of what the mean POC, population of color, is within that region and within particular tracts, as well as the percent of renters, percent of college educated, the median income, median rent, and median home value. These figures basically show that a large proportion of the low income or at risk or susceptible to displacement areas have a high POC population, whereas some of the exclusive areas have a very high rate within low rate of POC exclusive areas. Mean renters, there are more renters in areas that are low income or at risk, and college educated seems to ramp up as exclusive the neighborhood gets, as well as median household income, median rent, and median home value. So this is a feature that if you were able to go to our website and download our typology data for Atlanta, you could see this data right there. I'll go ahead and move forward to Chicago real quick. And
Tim, I'll just want to give you a reminder that I know we're moving pretty quickly to hit key takeaways, and I know you have a lot of other pieces to present. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you for putting me on there. This is the Chicago area. I'll let you all kind of take a look at it on your own, and so on with Denver and with Memphis. The key thing about Memphis in particular was that it was a little more difficult to predict some of these areas because of the economic structure of Memphis. But I just wanted to highlight these areas, and let's see. One last thing that we did in the key takeaways was we compared what the media thinks of as gentrifying neighborhoods versus what we find as gentrifying neighborhoods. And those are areas that are at risk or considered, the green here shows at risk, and the blue is considered what folks, for example, have been gentrifying. For example, in Atlanta, little 5 Points is an area that's been quote unquote gentrifying. It's actually, in our data, shows that it's already advanced or already exclusive. In other words, what people think of as gentrifying has already been there, but our maps do a pretty good job of showing where the at-risk or near gentrification spaces are located. These areas also have a high rate of POC population, which is a very troubling circumstance for a lot of households that are at risk. So I'll move on and pass it over back to Renee.
Thanks, Tim. So just to kind of tie things up on our end in terms of, how do we move forward from these maps? And, again, feel free to go to the website and dig deeper. Something that we talk about a lot when we talk about anti-displacement strategies is addressing the 3 Ps. So protection, protecting tenants, preservation, preserving affordable housing, and then production, increasing the supply of housing. And I've given a couple examples of the kinds of tactics that kind of fall into those 3 buckets. But it's important to note that these experiments around protection, preservation, and production, as well as policies around these 3 areas, exist in areas across the country. In California, there is, for example, statewide rent caps as well as just cause. In DC, there's one of the first tenant opportunity purchase programs, which allows renters to have first dibs on any any rental property that they're in or in their own building that's going to be converted into a condo. And then finally, there's a lot of work being done around preference policies, ensuring that residents of a particular neighborhood are prioritized when new subsidized housing is built. So this is just kind of a quick kind of overview of the kinds of strategies that we talk about. But again, this is really a time to talk about the 3 Ps in a national context as well. So, there are many avenues that could be taken in terms of, connecting the local to the national. And I think with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Tiffany Manuel to tell us more about how to make the case for anti-displacement. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much, Renee. So I'm happy to be here with you all today. So my part is relatively, I think, simple today. I think Renee and Tim got the hard challenge today of kind of sharing all the data. So I wanted to just have a little conversation about how we talk about some of this information. So I'm going to share my screen really briefly for just a few slides, and then I want to leave the bulk of our time together really for questions, mostly about the data, because I'm sure lots of you have ideas about what we should be doing with that. So let me just say at the very start of our conversation, as we begin to think about this, let's just start where we are. Let's step back out of the data for just a second and kind of zoom out to think about what we're trying to do here with this data. What does this data and information allow us to do in the context of what we're seeing across the country? So first of all, we know that our country right now is in my grandmother would probably say that, going to hell in a handbasket. Maybe we wouldn't say it quite like that. As a case maker, I would be more put a positive spin on it, but we got some pretty big issues happening. Every day I sort of read the paper or I turn on the news. Oh, really? And so that's at the broader level, but even in terms of what's happening in our communities around COVID-19 and trying to figure out the economic fallout and just a whole series of things that we have not addressed on top of things that were already challenging, like gentrification, displacement, issues of blight, vacancy, all kinds of issues. We are in for a pretty tough ride, right, in terms of how we resolve some of these issues. And so I just want to step back out of the data and just talk about the context in which this data is going to live, right? And I want to say, just as a matter of course, let's be very clear. As we're thinking about the data and how we use that and the evidence that we're going to be, the significant research that's been done around gentrification displacement, let's not let the urgency of this moment put us in a situation where we are solving for the wrong problem. I think this data helps us to solve some problems, and I really want us to get clear about what's the thing that we're solving with this data. And so a part of I want to say a couple of things. Number one, if we just look at what's happening nationally right now, or even probably in our communities, we're not in a situation where data is our problem, right? And I hope, I can't see your faces. Like if I were in a room, I would look for the nods, like, are we all clear about that? Or are there those of us who are still trying to figure out whether like we just got the wrong data? Like, you know, over the last 20, 30 years, we have plenty of data about what's happening in communities. I mean, it didn't take a whole lot of like, you know, rocket science to figure out that there are a whole lot of people in our country today that our systems are allowing to fail, right? On purpose, right? That's not an exaggeration. What we built systems that are designed not for equity, but to allow some folks to prosper and other folks maybe not. A system that has winners and has losers, and increasingly, right, the second category is growing, and we can tell that by issues of inequality. We can talk about that from health challenges. We can talk about from just even little things like the number of suicide, the suicide rate in the United States, even among youth, right? The suicide rate among youth is skyrocketing. There is something wrong in a nation where young people are killing themselves, right? What folks call deaths of despair, killing themselves before they even have a chance to learn how to drive or like fall in love or like do the things that you do. Like as youth, there's something wrong when they're not able to even get there. So the data itself, right? We're not solving the challenge of having more data or evidence. I want to also say, especially with respect to this, the wrong problem to solve is to think that what you all should do is take this data and then create a sort of public awareness campaign around it. Like, oh my gosh, look at how gentrification displacement is happening in our communities. And like, that is the story. What I will say to you, and you all know this true, if that's the story, it backfires on us significantly, right? For many of the reasons I'm going to talk about in just a second. But if public awareness is what we think our challenge is, then we're also mistaken. It's not that who's not aware, right? That you know, there are lots of parts of our communities that are being gentrified, or that where displacement of all varieties is happening. Like there are very few people, they may not want to acknowledge it or talk about it because it may mean that they have to do something about it. But very few people are really confused about that. And so folks who know my work, you know, I always talk about this issue. This is not an awareness problem. This is not the fact that people don't know that there are a lot of folks who are not benefiting from the prosperity of our nation, of our cities, right? There's a lot of prosperity happening. And I just want to say that right, if we go down the road of sort of solving those wrong problems, right, it forces us into a situation where we're not actually addressing the things that moves the dial, right? And if you think about it too, I mean, we just, and I know that people have different political persuasions, so I'm going to respect that, but I'm going to share mine. But I mean, think about the fact that we just had a presidential election in this country where 70 million people and counting were voting, not, I would say, on the basis of fact, right? Right? They were not voting on the basis of a shared reality, but on the basis of a kind of alternative reality that we're seeing play out, right? Alternative reality that fits a narrative that works for them, that has no basis in any relative facts, right? And you can fact check them every day of the week. It doesn't matter because they're creating, right, their own sense of narrative, their own sense of how the world should work. And they're holding on to a reality that I would say no longer exists. And so if we aren't able to break through that, if we aren't clear that our work has to get at the strength of a narrative that's big enough that people want to see themselves inside of the narrative that we're telling, right, then it won't help us very much. So the good news is this data is very helpful, but we got to use it and leverage it in the right way. And I'm going to talk about just very briefly from my short period of time here, how we do that. So what I want you to do from my vantage point is to really see the information that both Renee and Tim have talked about and the significant resources on the website, as an opportunity to do two things. One, to unseat some pretty dominant narratives that I would say are pretty destructive, right, for us. They don't help us to move policy and systems change and investments in a way that's thoughtful. In fact, they are barriers to getting more public support for the kinds of work that we know would help. So we need to unseat some of that stuff. We need to dig it out and kind of excavate it and move it on, right? And then also make a strong affirmative case for the things that we know would make a difference. So one of the things I thought I would do, because the usefulness, I think, of what Tim and Renee have been able to do and the team has been able to do is really give us some core findings that we can lift out of this work and then share with our communities, but in a way that does these two things: unseat that dominant narrative and then make a strong case. So I want to go through some of those larger findings, talk about what the dominant narratives that exist, talk about how it backfires, but then also perhaps give you some alternative language for addressing some of those issues. So let me actually go to that first, and then I'll come back to that challenge. So let's just go to some of the major findings. So on the left was one of the major findings that came out of this project was that there are very racialized patterns of neighborhoods, and the patterns of neighborhood change persist. The dominant narrative that people hold, which is a challenge for us, is folks will say, yeah, I mean, like displacement and racial segregation is how I would also describe it, are natural outcomes of a functioning market-driven economy. Like, people make choices, people have choices. So if you go in any city, if you go to Atlanta, Chicago, Memphis, whatever the city is, there are communities that are all Black folks, and there are neighborhoods that are all whites, and there are neighborhoods that are may have Latinx populations of various kinds, or that may have predominance of one group. And there may even be neighborhoods that are mixed in orientation, and people move in and out as they make choices about where they want to live. That's how the thing works. And they would say segregation is probably not a bad thing. Some people want to live with people who look like them, and they have to choose, given the market conditions, to stay there or not. So the backfire that happens when we try to talk about these issues is, hey, people, you got to choose. You got a whole range of choices about where you can move or where you can rent. Go move, right? Go find some place. And if you are unhappy, like many of us on this call are unhappy with the patterns that we're seeing across our cities, if you are unhappy, then make some different choices and encourage the people that you know in your network to do the same. That's what you do in a market-driven economy. So what I want to say is, on the right side of the screen is the alternative narrative that we want to replace that with. That neighborhood patterns around displacement and segregation are actually a function of some very intentional policies and systems that have to be fundamentally reimagined with equity at the center. That's the bigger narrative. And how you might operationalize that as part of your conversation is say, hey, listen, there's nothing natural about these patterns and the systems that produce them. We made these systems, and we can remake them so that they function better for everybody. And what I'm trying to get y'all to do is to address, right, these larger issues, unseating this idea that somehow this is natural, that people make choices. This is not about the choices of individual people to be in the neighborhood or not. This is about systems that, for all intents and purposes, made those choices possible or not. So that's a way to get around some of the dominance of the narratives and the backfire that you might result. One of the second findings on here on the left was that new investment, particularly in urban greening projects, is perpetuating displacement. And that conversation will meet very quickly with a conversation that's dominant around, hey, listen, any investment, particularly in a distressed community, is progress, people. All right? That's some progress. And the backfire often looks like this. I just don't know how to make these people happy. First, they say there's not enough investment in their communities. But we haven't invested enough in this community or that. Then they say it's not the quote unquote right investment. Be glad that we're able to do any kind of investments in this economic climate. We're giving y'all something, right? And I have seen that narrative play out in a lot of contexts. In fact, for those of you, this is probably one you've probably heard a lot. I would say for those of you who've seen that, put +1 in the chat, but you've heard or are experiencing some of these narratives in your community, so we could all talk about that and really drill into that. The alternative narrative that we want to share is that not all investments are the same. Not all investments yield the kind of financial and social return that actually benefits all of us. So the idea of this is, and I give you some language about how to operationalize the conversation, is The idea is to push back on the idea that any investment, any amount of dollars, right, is good. No, right? We refuse to accept the idea that we have to choose between growth or development and overall well-being. And so you could say something like, we know that every community in our city can be both a great place to live with more green space than ever, and can provide housing stability for people at all levels. All right. So let me just go over I think I have 3 more kind of research findings that came out from the overarching findings across all the sites. A third research finding: disinvestment continues to threaten the livelihoods of low-income communities and communities of color. That's an important finding. That's going to meet very quickly with several dominant narratives. One, all this disinvestment stuff is about low-income people and people of color who fail to invest in their neighborhoods. Also a narrative around the fact that, well, once you start to improve a neighborhood, you got to get the poor people out, because who the hell wants, if you have resources and you're trying to be upwardly mobile, who the hell wants to live next door to poor people? Because they associate people of color and low income with being poor. And because that's a negative conversation, people think of where they live as an asset, right? And so that narrative gets quickly met with something that's not helpful. And the third one is this really unhelpful thing about how being poor or how being displaced or the threat of those things is a motivator. Yeah, so in this culture, you don't want to be the guy who doesn't have any resources, so it makes you work harder, right? You go to, right, so this notion of having your bootstraps and work ethos as being connected to the idea that you're running from the fear of being poor or being displaced, and that's actually a motivator, that when people are afraid of this stuff, that makes them work hard. And if you give them more resources, right, they won't work as hard, right? Because then you've given them, right, all the things they need to live and thrive. So if you don't frame that well or put that in a bigger story, it gets met very quickly with a backfire that says, yep, Black and brown people, they should really learn how to save their money. They should buy some homes, maybe buy businesses in those neighborhoods, and they should invest in their neighborhoods. Work hard to afford to live where you want to live or to stay where you want to stay. In other words, this gets thrown back on, right, people of color, saying this is or low income folks, this is your problem, go figure it out, right? This is about you being motivated to buy, right, in your neighborhood. And I've even seen this backfire happen where folks will say, why don't people of color understand property rights? That you get a chance to stay here because you buy something here. When you don't buy something, you don't get a chance to stay, and you don't have the right, to shape how this neighborhood is formed or benefits. And so that conversation backfire is not helpful. The alternative narrative is to push back on that, right? That resigning people to perpetual poverty and hardship is not only unjust, but it's actually pretty costly. It actually costs us money to try to have a system that pushes people into a situation where they can't move forward. They can't buy in their neighborhoods. They don't have resources to do that. They're constantly moving because, right, as things get more expensive, people are trying to find places to live. And it's unsustainable. And quite frankly, it's racist. So the ideas we all benefit when we dismantle some of these unjust systems that have kept whole neighborhoods and groups of people in an unnecessary cycle of hardship. And I would say an unnecessary cycle also of instability. So the way you might operationalize that is a narrative around that we all need to thrive. Like, it's unjust, it's unfair, and it's costly to exclude people from the benefits of stability and thriving communities. Our work to strengthen the stability of neighborhoods for all people is part of an intentional effort to envision a different, more equitable way forward for all people who live and love our city, right? Everybody thrives, no exceptions. That kind of narrative, right, is one that people can see themselves inside of. Okay, just 2 more, and then I'm gonna wrap it up for the Q&A that we're gonna have. So displacement is, one of the findings was displacement is impacting the social determinants of health due to loss of community resources, social networks, and educational opportunities. And that gets met with the dominant narrative about health. Health as an issue individualizes very quickly. People say, hey, like, you are responsible for your own health. I'm not responsible for your health. Nobody in this community is responsible for your health, and vice versa. And the backfire, people will say, community health, good luck with that. We can't even figure out how to get people to wear masks. Everybody needs to take care of their own health. You take care of you, I'll take care of me. We're all good. We don't need policy, right? Let's just take care of ourselves. And so the alternative narrative is one that we want to share, right? It pushes back on it and unseats that our health is actually directly connected to the environments around us, that investing in those environments, i.e. our neighborhoods, actually helps keep us safe. It helps fuel our economy. It reinforces our resources for long-term wellness. That's good for people. That's actually good for business. And it's also good for everybody's health. And so the way you might operationalize that in your narrative, you could say, you could even use the COVID-19 and flip that back on people. That you can say, yeah, exactly. COVID-19, if nothing else, it has reminded us how reliant we really are on each other to stay healthy, that my health actually depends on yours and yours depends on mine. The same way that your housing stability, right, is connected to mine. And so the fact that our fates are connected, our health is connected, our homes are connected, and the way you all can give examples of how that's shaped, like the guy down the street, the community next door, their financial stability is actually connected to yours. The more you give examples of that, the more people remember the ways in which we are interdependent on each other for our collective success. That's a narrative that you want people to lean into. So the final one is that kind of global finding is that climate change is expected to exacerbate this kind of ongoing displacement. That's going to get met with a series of dominant narratives, two of the strongest of which are, is climate change even a thing? Because right, we're still denying, a lot of us are still denying that that's even a thing. It's getting warmer in Chicago. That's a good thing, right? Right. And then the second thing is folks will say climate change is just too hard to solve. Like we have more pressing issues today. We're trying to deal with COVID-19. My kids don't have, like, I'm trying to get, as the backfire says, who cares if climate change is, if the climate is changing? I cannot afford to feed my kids today. You're talking to me about something that won't affect us for 50 years. Solve tomorrow's problems tomorrow. I'm trying to solve what's happening in my life today. We're trying to solve for the issues today. You can hear that in policymakers' conversations. They may not say it quite so, quite in that way. They would couch it in a very different right way, but the impact of that would be the same. The alternative narrative that we want to be able to share is that the challenges that we are experiencing today are tough and they require immediate action. But those immediate actions are short-sighted if they don't help us to plan for our future and for the legacy that we're trying to leave our children, right? The legacy that they're going to inherit from us. So how we might operationalize that in two ways, right? One, we can talk about climate change is not only a future challenge, it's a today opportunity. Because when we advance climate conscious solutions, we actually address many of the immediate challenges that we need, that need our attention right now, like the fact that so many of our neighbors, our friends, our families are being displaced from the communities that they love. That is a narrative about the future today. Let's get at it. And then the second part you might have say about, hey, listen, it's more about the future today, but especially with respect to sustainable communities. We all want to live in sustainable communities, but fostering a sustainable community requires us to do the work to plan for our future today. And the good news is that when we approach problem solving today by planning for what we'll need tomorrow, the quality of those solutions, the quality of the solutions we get are actually better, right? And so I should take the we out of there, again, the future is today. So I just wanted to share, like when we are talking about the data that we have around some of these issues and we're trying to make sense of this for other folks, what I don't want you all to do is to take that data and say, hey, listen, and how many people of color don't have a place to live, right? I want you to anticipate what you're going to meet in terms of the dominant narrative, even from folks who are, let's just call them relatively progressive, right? The folks who could and should be on our team on some of these issues. Even from those folks, you often get this kind of backfire. I want us to get in front of that, to say, here's an alternative way to think about this. And then let us figure out together how we operationalize the alternative to that narrative. The last thing I'll say is just that this is, narrative development is part of a broader strategy of how you make a case. So I didn't go into all the pieces of that today. I want to be really focused on the research in front of us and the way we can share that. But I also do want to say that SPARCC has generously provided lots of resources for my team to work with a lot of the sites. So if there are sites on the call who want some help crafting a response, how are they using the data that they're seeing on the site to talk about these issues, we're happy to follow up with some additional resources and some one-on-one time with some of the teams. So I'm going to stop there. and turn this back over for Q&A.
So we've got a couple questions that are in the chat, but I just want to give folks a couple minutes to, as we're moving in, to get your questions together. You can go ahead and chat them to me and put them in the chat. But I think we've also had some that came in during the session that I'm just going to ask folks if they want to uplift. I know some of them are going to be a little bit specialized on geography, and so we may have to follow up with that answer, but let's just open up to the group. Darius, I think I saw a question from you early on. Would you like to unmute, or would you like me to read out your question?
Oh, so I'm unmuted. So I think in 2017, the city of Atlanta, they were in the process of tearing down Atlanta Fulton County Stadium that had been there for a while. And there was this attempt, the community that surrounded it, they were trying to keep it from coming this high-priced area, and they wanted to focus on the needs of housing, in particular African-American communities. I mean, people, because the area surrounding that was already sparse when it came to like housing medium and low income individuals. So I just wanted to know, did that area, when they tore the stadium down and it proceeded with the construction, does anyone know what happened to that plot of land? Or did it become what the community was fighting so hard for it not to become?
That's a great question, Darius. Tim, I don't know if you could speak to that, or if anyone else on the call could speak to that. I personally don't have specific knowledge of that project, but would love to hear from others too.
Yeah, my video is off just because my internet connection is a little weaky, but I've heard about that program, and I don't think there's any insight yet on what's going on officially. I think some community groups do know what's happened there. And this highlights one of the issues that our data struggles with, is that there's kind of a lag effect of, we use in the SPARCC maps, we use 2017 American Community Survey data, which spans 5 years. And so that's right in the middle of that 5-year period. Now, despite the fact that there's a lag, that still highlights, we're impressed at how well it highlights future gentrification. But I believe, and I would hope that somebody with better knowledge of that area could speak to this more, but I think the Beltline also impacted and through some of the effects that the tearing down of Fulton County Stadium might have had in that area too. So it's hard to isolate whether it was just strictly Fulton County Stadium or a combination of multiple projects going on and around that area.
And then I would think to integrate a question, if I'm able to do so. One of the things that we're seeing out here in the Bay Area, more and more people that I've talked to, because of the prices and housing in the Bay Area, more and more people are, oh, I'm going to move to Atlanta, I'm going to move to Georgia, right? And so my question is, why is it so attractive then to people of color if we have all this displacement already going on in Atlanta, right? It seems to be attractive for us out here in the Bay Area if you can't afford to live right now. But why? What makes it so attractive if you have all this displacement going on as we speak now?
Another really good question, Darius. I think, this is kind of the struggle when we talk about kind of gentrification and displacement and kind of the relationship between the two, not just in Atlanta, but across the country. I think there, a lot of people may assume that, areas that are gentrifying are not necessarily experiencing displacement. But I think our maps help to show that actually exists, and our maps provide kind of a predictive tool for doing so. So while I don't have like I don't have the answer for your question, I think what I could offer is that, just being able to kind of show the evidence is one step in kind of moving towards a local anti-displacement strategy that addresses the displacement that's happening and ongoing, while kind of planning for future growth and for future people moving into the area. Tim, I don't know if you have anything to add about Atlanta specifically in this context.
Yeah, I would just kind of highlight what Renee is saying too, is that displacement we're starting to see tends to precede gentrification altogether quite a bit. And I did a deep study of of King County and Washington. Different. I came from Atlanta and I saw similar patterns of displacement going on in those two cities. What's interesting is displacement preceding gentrification. Another thing that preceded gentrification was eviction. And it's also highly concentrated within POC neighborhoods too. And to Tiffany's point, Dr. T's point about how we need to kind of be careful about reclaiming these narratives. I think that, there's a lot of legacies too that continue to perpetuate themselves as well, and they just have a different face right now. And these are areas that we just hope that our research can help highlight and get people to think more about how this is happening, and help provide tools as like kind of the root to start building out what's going on, the base to start diving into those questions a little bit more. So
I wanted to offer up just what was in the chat. Actually, I think Renee Skeet, just that's exactly right. And Tim, you were trying to tie that together, that the myth of what Atlanta is, particularly for people of color, is important, that it's not just a matter of how much it costs. There's the idea that if you are in a city where you can see the benefits of, people of color seeming to have great positions, you got a mayor, you got a this, you got a that, you got the presidents of banks, you got kids who go to great schools. Even if it's tough, if you're struggling in a city that's tough, but there are people like you who are succeeding, it signals to folks that there may be some opportunities, some pathways at least to opportunity, if not for you, then for your kids. And that's really attractive to folks, right? Even if they know they have to struggle with issues of displacement because of what's happening in terms of the regional economic circumstances. And so I would just remind people, don't underestimate the power of narrative, right? Even when it doesn't always measure up to the reality of what folks are facing. If the myth is strong enough, if the narrative is strong enough, people act on that, right? And it changes the collective patterns of a community or place.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. There are definitely some additions to that folks wanted to share in the chat. So dare take a look at those responses. But I know, Deborah, you had a question. So if you want to go ahead and share, that would be great.
So the first question I have is really for the group. If you are working in a city that has a great anti-displacement policy, if you could send it our way, we'd be really appreciative of that, because we are now working to push the city of Concord to establish at least a commitment to anti-displacement if we can't get a full policy or ordinance on. But the second question really is how to prevent, I mean, I really appreciate, I think it was Tim who said, or I don't know who said evictions precede gentrification. We're certainly seeing that now. We saw it before COVID-19 in Concord's Monument Corridor, which is a predominantly Latinx community. And the Anti-Displacement Project actually did a study back in 2015 called Displacement and Speculation in the Monument Corridor, and everything that was sort of predicted then has really come true today, although it's kind of in a bumpy holding pattern because of COVID-19 right now. So really my question is how do you prevent gentrification and displacement in this low-income Latinx community that might really be accelerated by a new park renovation project. And we saw this happen in preceding years when we were advocating for the 3 parks to be improved because they were just havens for drug dealing and stuff. We saw suddenly houses were getting more sold and apartment complexes were renovating, and there was a lot of displacement now. So we're trying to avoid that with this project if the city gets state money to do this work. So that was my question.
Thanks, Deborah. Those are both great questions. And just your first question about any cities that have anti-displacement strategies that would be worth sharing. So, so we've kind of been in contact with a number of cities in California who are actually going through the process now of coming up with kind of a broader anti-displacement strategy. And what that involves is not necessarily ignoring any kind of housing policy around protections or preservations that's already in place, but rather kind of trying to coordinate across some of those existing policies while thinking about additional strategies like community land trusts, like land banking, like any strategy that ensures that future affordable housing is preserved. So, so I can definitely point you to some resources on urbandisplacement.org, as well as some other resources that came about. And regarding how to prevent displacement, I think the best example that comes to mind to me is the Unity Council in Oakland and the work that they've done around the Fruitville Transit Village. There was actually a study that was done by, I believe it was USC, which I can chat in right after I finish talking, where they actually analyzed displacement pressures and neighborhood change in the Fruitville district of Oakland, also predominantly Latinx community historically, following the development of the Fruitville Transit Village, which is a transit-oriented development project that is actually considered a model of equitable transit-oriented development, because it's not just housing and businesses around transit, but it's community-owned businesses and affordable housing near transit. So this study found that actually displacement did not happen at nearly the scale that one would expect, given that it's the Bay Area, number one, and given that it is a neighborhood that would be considered one that is experiencing a lot of displacement pressures from everything going on regionally. So the study itself kind of goes into specifics, but I think the fact that it identified a neighborhood that was able, that in a hot real estate market that was able to prevent displacement is really astounding. And I think the conditions for the success there really really kind of point to the role of the Unity Council as a community quarterback and as an organization that's a community development corporation that not only develops affordable housing in the area, but also provides services to residents and coordinates the two. So, so I would say, the key to an effective anti-displacement strategy is not just the policies, not just the local policies and the national policies, but really, let's look at the community infrastructure and the community development corporations in particular, who have, historically done, such an amazing job of ensuring that resident voice is part of the planning process and that community needs are really up front and center. So I will chat in the link to that study for all of you in a moment.
Sarah, I saw you had a question. Did you want to go ahead and share?
Hi, yes. My question is for Dr. Manuel or others on the call. If they could speak to the lack of resources in terms of the scale of the solutions that are often invested towards anti-displacement challenges, even in areas where policymakers have acknowledged the scale of that need. And sometimes you end up with what feel like really watery solutions, or you end up with the inability to kind of untangle these very highly meshed systems of housing and land use agencies that can be localized. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I think that's exactly right. You just hit on something that's really important. That to scale on two issues. One is the scale of the problem that we're talking about, and the other is the scale of the resources that we're often given to try and solve for it. And so, what's interesting about scale is, at least in terms of what the the solutions are, the things that we need to actually combat, right? The issues is that people have to be bought into the fact that this is a problem. And I think on this issue of gentrification displacement, not a whole lot of folks, right? Especially, well, let me say that, take that back. A lot of the folks that we need who are gatekeepers of resources are not always convinced that this is a problem or a problem that needs to be prioritized, right? And so even before we get to the scale questions, like you got to convince folks first that they have a stake in resolving the thing that we're talking about, because it is a broader collective problem. Right now, when folks talk about gentrification displacement, it sounds like a problem for Black and brown people.
But it's not.
Right? It's
not.
Oh, I got muted by mistake. How much of that did y'all hear? So often when people, when we talk about these issues, that it sounds like this is a problem for Black and brown people, in which case they say, well, go solve it. Black people and brown people go get it, right? What are you looking at me for? Right? And so then it doesn't get ratcheted up to the level of this is a problem for all of us, no matter what your background is, racial or ethnic or otherwise. It doesn't matter your economic circumstances. And unless you make that part first, right, you won't get the scale of resources that you need to solve it. So I would say the first is to do a check on the folks that you're talking to in your city council, of your mayor, of those stakeholders in your community where you need folks to buy into this conversation. Do they really get that this is a collective problem that actually affects all of us, that they have a stake in, that we all have a stake in? At first, if they do, then the good news is then you can work on the issues of scale, which is, we know this is a problem that faces all of us. Now let's talk about not only the scale of the need, but the scale of the resources that we should put toward fighting that. And the good news there is, once people have bought into the idea that it's a collective issue, you've got a shot at talking about, like, what's the scale of, what's the benefit of the investment that we're making in people in this community? What happens when we invest, right, to make sure that people are able to stay stabilized in their homes and their communities? What does that look like? And then you can talk about the benefits. So all I just wanted to say is that you asked a very nuanced question, but one that's very important. The first part is making sure that the stakeholders that you need to open up those resources really understand this is a problem that needs to be prioritized, and then addressing these issues of scale as a secondary question.
So there's a question that is for, I think, Tim, around data, or Renee, maybe you want to handle this, but looking across the strategies in the 3 Ps chart, would you prioritize certain strategies for different categories of gentrification risk?
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally there are strategies that coordinate all 3. I think, in California, where there is a lot of talk about implementing policies across the 3 Ps, I think the problem is that production is often prioritized at the expense of protection and preservation, given that there's such a problem with the lack of just not just affordable housing supply, but housing supply in general in the Bay Area and Los Angeles as well. I think my personal view on this, and Tim and Dr. T chime in, is that housing preservation is an area that is just not prioritized enough. So we have made strides in protections, and unfortunately, COVID has actually allowed many cities to move forward with certain protections that did not exist, that are now protecting folks from unlawful evictions during this time. Of course, they will eventually expire, and so there needs to be some thought put into, okay, what happens after that? How do we actually take what we've accomplished with protections and actually move it beyond COVID? But I think this idea of housing preservation and preserving existing affordable housing is something that is being done in a lot of different ways, whether it's through community land trusts, whether it's through land banking for future affordable housing development, But I think, especially now that, we are entering kind of a down market, unfortunately, this is actually the time to buy up property. For a developer, this is the time to buy up property and leverage the down market to actually preserve affordable housing. So my personal thought is that, preservation should be prioritized more now. Protections, is something that is often a place that we say is a good place to start, because you have to stabilize stabilize residents where they live at, if before and while you wait for new housing to be built. But that's just my kind of personal view. I definitely, there are many ways to go about this, but I'll leave it at that.
I'll just add real quickly too. I think it depends on the location where you're at. Case in point, I'm working with the city of Baltimore on evictions, and it's a much different circumstance than what's going on in Washington State, another place I've been helping work on with evictions. Now in Washington State, we showed that, the statistic that 1 in 6 Black adults had an eviction in one of the counties. That was enough to change a state law. In Baltimore City, you have the state of Maryland that consistently has a legacy of denying Baltimore, a lot of access to political clout because it's quote unquote a Black city, it's a Black issue, yada, yada. And so back to Dr. T's point of like, this is an everybody issue. This is a grand scheme of inequality that has been going on in a way that, we have to figure it out. And so the strategy may be different. And so in that case, in preservation, if it's preservable, that's awesome. Protection often is, like just cause and all those things are when there's no capital to preserve. What are some political means that we could do to try and protect in some way? Because there is no means to preserve or produce at that time. So I think handling that, I also will encourage collaborations across policymakers, academics, and grassroots folks. That has a really powerful impact in making change in a lot of ways, in trying to figure out the best route with that too.
I'm going to open it up, I think, just to 1 or 2 more questions, because we just want to move on and we're running short on time. But in the meantime, so if anyone wants to ask a question, this is your time. I also just want to uplift the question Devin asked in the chat, and then Dr. T, your response to that, because I know some folks are on the call. Devin, your question was, the dominant narratives are so simple and the counter narratives are so complex and nuanced. How do we convince folks not to take the mentally easy path?
Yeah. And then, so I'm happy to share my response. I was just sharing that it's interesting. A part of the reason why the dominant narrative sounds so easy, because we're so used to hearing them. So I don't even have to finish the sentence, because you already mentally, as soon as I start going down that road, you've already used to hearing it so much. You're like, yeah, I got it. And so, it makes it easier for folks. I mean, believe you can almost tune out. If you hear the first 3 or 4 words in that sentence, you already know, right, where that conversation is going. And so it makes it easier to talk about that. On the flip side, right, we are at the point on this part of the journey where you and I are going to have what we might call those courageous conversations, where it's still pretty tough going, where you are trying to embed a new narrative, a new way for people to think about the stuff. And so it takes time, because folks have to actually listen. Like, what are you saying? Like, they have to listen a little bit, right, to get you to hear it. And a lot of the work that I do, I teach and I work with folks to figure out how to do what we call slow braining people. How do you get people to listen when they don't want to, right? You slow brain people. You say something in a way that's provocative, that forces them to stop and go, wait, what did you just say? Because they need to understand, like, what the heck you just said. And I'll just say, there are not many things I will say that our current outgoing president does well. Let's stress the outgoing president does well. But one of the things, if nothing else, that he should have he has taught us well, if we are good students of history, is how you slow brain people. When he says something so outrageous, or like, you know, he'll say something really crazy, and you have to stop and listen, because you are just kind of like, wait, what did you just, I mean, like, so we give that our full attention. We end up giving, right, a lot of our attention, right, to this person, because we're trying to really figure out what he's saying. And so the opportunity for us is to do something similar. I'm not saying go out and say something crazy, but what I am saying, that we have to be somewhat provocative, right, in a way that forces folks to lean in, to say, wait, what are you saying? And you know, in the health space, I mean, even you know, many years ago, when folks were just talking about zip code, like people would just come out and say zip code is a better predictor of your health than your genetic code. When people first started saying that, all of us had to like stop to understand, like, what are you talking about? Because we didn't understand, like, we were trying to figure out what does zip code have to do with. But now when I say it, all I have to do is zip code is A, and then all of us know what like, you don't have to listen to the rest of the sentence, because you already know where that's going. But you know, for the first folks who were coming out with courageous conversations, trying to land that narrative, they had to do it in a way that was provocative to get people to lean in and go. And then we actually had to do the mental work to try to figure out what they meant. And now we got it. So think of it as you and I on this call, we're at the beginning of that cycle. We're saying zip code is a better predictor. We're saying that it doesn't have to be this way. Here's a better way to do it. And the more provocative we can do that without being crazy, right? The more provocative we can do that without, right, the better, because it gets people to just stop for a second. So anyway, I hope that's helpful. I feel like we're on ground zero here in terms of messaging about this stuff and making it stick.
I'll also add that, you know, just kind of speaking to the data that we've been able to mine through and make accessible through our maps, you know, when you combine the narrative with the evidence, I think that's when you've got the, you know, the sweet sauce. So I think that is something that helps to kind of push the more nuanced kind of narrative that is not part of the dominant narrative, and push it towards the dominant narrative. And I think that's the strongest argument we could make for all of these things. We have evidence for all of these, you know, things that we're talking about, the racialized patterns of neighborhood change, the effects of urban greening on displacement. We have numbers around it. And the numbers definitely get the attention of policymakers and politicians, but the numbers can also get the attention of kind of a wider audience too.
Okay, folks, I think we've got a score of questions. I know there's going to be a couple more questions, and we're going to, as we mentioned in the chat, we're going to actually follow up with some resources, some of the links mentioned, and also provide the opportunity to ask Dr. T and Renee and Tim more questions on our SPARCC Community of Practice, and maybe also have some more conversation with the other participants. So I think we're almost about ready to wrap up. I'll kick it back to Dr. T, and yeah, let's go.
Yeah, so I don't know that I have that much to say in terms of a wrap up. I feel like we had a pretty quick kind of going hour where we were able to get a lot of good questions on the table, and I think Renee just did actually a really great job of summarizing. I think with this conversation, that we have some really powerful data and research that, when it combined with narrative, gives us a better shot at changing policy and changing systems. I just want to say that this data, I don't know that Renee or Tim just had quite enough time to kind of give us the full benefit of it, but it's really, really powerful. I was saying the same thing just a couple of weeks ago to my friend Richard Rothstein, who many of you know wrote The Color of Law, and I was sharing that a part of what made his analysis really important, I think, for the movement, especially on issues, some of the issues we're talking about, is that for many, many years, right, like people of color have been talking about how systems were designed, right, for folks to fail. And we have been talking like that. And it sounded like it was a bunch of conspiracy theories because we didn't have the evidence to show. And so when Richard dropped his book, it was like, okay, you see what we're saying? There's evidence here, people. We're not just like conspiracy theorists, like saying like the world, right? We know the ways these systems have been intentionally designed to help some, but not others. And now we have the evidence to share it. And that, I think, has created a different conversation around a whole series of issues on racial segregation. I think the same is true here, that I think what the Urban Displacement Project has been able to do for us in terms of these maps is to say, this is not just our imagination. Like, it's not just conspiracy theory here. We know that displacement is happening. There are different kinds of displacement, and we know that it looks different in different places, but there is a core set of things here for us to be talking about. So we don't have to go out and sound like we're conspiracy theorists here. There's evidence to show that. Now the challenge is to take that evidence and share it in a way that makes people feel like they're part of a conversation, and that's a story they want to be part of. That's why you're building a bigger narrative around it. Like, this is about all of us, not just the folks who may be on the wrong side of the impacts, right, of the gentrification displacement we're talking about. So I feel like, again, I feel like this is ground zero. Like, this is the moment where there's a real opportunity to advance a different common understanding than we have in the past, because now we have both evidence and some better ways to share a narrative that can move people forward. So all that to say, that's all I got for today. Ground zero we are.
Well, I guess I get to close us out here, but I will pick up on that point and say that, 2020 has been quite a year in so many respects, but one of the things that's, that's a little inspiring maybe is that you see a lot of folks who are not subject to these market forces, who are not on the losing end, trying to step up and trying to understand structural racism, trying to understand these more complex systems, trying to understand those things that are obvious to them. And with that, there might be an opening for them to keep feeding those folks new information, help them understand the world as we've come to understand it over the last several years. And I'll say for us on the SPARCC team, we really have a lot of work to do in terms of pushing some of the stuff that we have on deck for the new administration in the new year. One piece in particular we've been working on with a lot of folks on this call is about sort of a reboot of the NSP program to invest that money primarily in community-based organizations and really capitalize folks to be able to do some of this work and not just the larger, more established housing organizations. So we've got a lot to do to sort of rework some of our messaging as we go out and try and socialize that document. But with that, I want to thank everybody. If there are burning questions that have come up in the last few minutes, we can stay on for a few. But otherwise, enjoy your holiday, and I hope this was helpful. Thanks.
And as we mentioned in the chat, we'll be following up over email with recording any of the resources and links mentioned. I know there are a lot of great data links that came up. We'll share those out, and we'll also give folks who, if you're kind of new to the SPARCC network, we'll give you access to our new community of practice platform, which will really allow you to kind of engage more in this conversation. And a big thank you again to Dr. T and Renee and Tim and Devin for just bringing this awesome presentation together. Thanks, folks.